I'd met her at a faux English pub in Warsaw. Most of us met our wives at one climber's drinking hole or another. But I'd had good timing. It turned out that she'd just come from a coworker's retirement party, at which she'd heard him joke about the number of years he'd worked at his bureau, more than she had been alive. And then he had estimated the actual number of staff meetings he'd attended and evaluations he had filed. And she said that a horrified silence had settled over the party. And she had decided then and there to quit. The pub had been the first one she had encountered. When she asked what I did, I told her I climbed the highest mountains in the world in the winter. We went home together that same night. She had some idea what she was getting herself into, she told me that first night while we spooned, and she smoothed her hands together along my erection. Her brother had been a rock climber and mountaineer. I'd failed to pursue the subject because she had by then fitted me into her with a tenderness and calm that I'd previously associated only with the afterlife. Shh, she whispered at the force of my response. Look. And she brought her mouth around to mine. She meant, look how comprehensively we've merged. She didn't have to tell me. I was already so confounded that for an hour after she fell asleep, I perched naked on her chest of drawers, peering down at her like a traveler who found water on Mars. Because as a child, I'd been such an aberration when it came to inwardness and appearance that my classmates had christened me the White Crow. My first years of schooling had been traumatic, and I withdrew from any social situation in which I felt maligned. Climbing had been my way out. My aptitude for math and science had won me some recognition, and I'd been invited to join the geology section of the Young Pioneers, and the field trips to the mountains had begun there. There I learned about rope and free climbing, about weather and snow conditions. But I still was valued only for what I could do. My mentor on those trips used to say that our relationship thrived on my achievements. I'd been 3 hours late for our first dinner together, and Agnieszka had already eaten and gone about her evening. She warmed up my portion after I arrived. You aren't angry, I asked. You've already eaten? Why would I be angry, she answered, looking up from her book. And why wouldn't I have eaten? She told me the first time I left for an 8,000-meter mountain that she wasn't going to become one of those women her brother's friends used to pity, the climber's girlfriend left moping at home. On the radio telephone from Annapurna, I complimented her on her poise when we'd kissed goodbye. She said, you should have seen me once you were out of sight. And now what does she have? Now she and Wanda are home alone most of the time in Miliec. Miliec is famous as the place in southern Poland where hope goes to expire. Is it so bad, her mother asked before she first came to visit? And Agnieszka found she couldn't bring herself to answer. It's astonishing that you grew up here, she likes to tell me. Or maybe it's not. At town meetings, after the first 3 hours on economic growth, we sometimes get to the fouled water table or the air pollution. It had a big Jewish community, which was, of course, wiped out in the war. It features the largest aviation factory in Poland, where we both work. For tourists, there's the minor basilica of Matthew the Evangelist, which is ugly. For football, there's FKS Stal Miliec, the perennial third division, also ran. We have a sister city in Ukraine that I'm told is every bit as demoralizing. There's a water park. Potholes aren't the problem they used to be. And around our 3-room house, we have enough land fenced off for a kitchen garden and a pygmy orchard. In Islamabad, we were informed about the extra expense of the bond that had to be posted for the possibility of a helicopter rescue, which was particularly maddening since we'd be operating nearly the entire time above a helicopter's ceiling. It's no wonder so many teams press on for the summits, even in insanely dangerous circumstances, given that each year the cost of climbing in the Himalayas becomes more and more prohibitive. The highest mountains are now lucrative commercial concerns. On our last day in the city, Kozniak showed us our expedition's revised bank account, which was a disheartening sight. We now had enough to get to the mountain and climb it, though not enough, technically, to get back home. We'd chosen the Kinshofer route on the mountain's Diamir face, which meant a longer trek across the glaciers to our base camp. At the little town where we hired our porters, the usual gaggle assembled outside our hotel, some having walked from villages 50 kilometers away, and Kozniak did the selecting by eye. He said he used to check all candidates with a stethoscope, but then discovered that most had blood-curdling noises coming from their lungs, and others apparently had no hearts in their chests. From there we all jounced for 6 hours along a muddy and narrow road through brilliant light. At curves along the Indus Gorge, the lead driver would stop and beckon us all out to look over the edge, down the cliffs to the river below. At one hairpin he kept gesturing into a ravine whose drop was so severe none of us would look. Besides Kozniak, Jacek, and myself, Poland's banner is held aloft by Nowakowski and Letzik, 2 old campaigners, and Bienek, a late replacement none of us know very well. Nowakowski is the sort of legend who on one 12-kilometer hike into base camp stunned all of those who hadn't been able to maintain his pace by producing an entire watermelon from his backpack to share upon arrival. They call him Filthy N because he refuses to wash even weeks after an expedition is ended. A woman he once tried to pick up in a bar at first refused to believe that the smell was him. Only the year before, Letzik had all of the amputations on his right hand, and with his damaged toes, could not entertain hopes of a summit, though he thought he might get as far as 7,000 meters depending on how his older frostbitten areas held up at altitude. He claimed that nearly all of his preparation was psychological, by which he meant last-minute parties, all-night binges, and as much sex as the women around him would allow. On his last night in Warsaw, he threw up over the balcony onto a pizza delivery boy and then tumbled over the railing to follow. The boxes broke his fall. Poor Bienek seems not to know what to make of us. He's a quiet young man whose wrist alarm features a digital recording of his son's voice, wishing him a good morning and exhorting him to come back safely. Jacek I got to know in the Young Pioneers. We both suffered from childhood asthma, not unusual for climbers, perhaps because lungs stressed by the affliction become better conditioned to process oxygen later in life. We instantly became adept at egging each other on when it came to risks. On one of the field trips, we celebrated his 16th birthday by abandoning the bus that was supposed to return us to the city to see if we could walk back through the forests. We arrived 5 days later, having survived on berries and 2 loaves of bread. We'd asked a friend to tell our poor parents we'd gone camping. Above 8,000 meters in winter, everyone needs to be technically proficient and emotionally unflappable. Jacek started climbing chairs and tables when he was 15 months old, and is ingenious with gigantic spatial puzzles, like ice falls. And once totaled his brand new car in a drainage ditch and simply climbed out and continued to the party on foot. His friends noticed the trauma only when it became clear at the end of the night that he couldn't lift a broken left arm. His wife Christina was even less happy than Agnieszka about having been relocated to Milgate. The official story was that he was taking a position as coach for the local ski program, which, though the pay was miserable, would allow him to maintain his training schedule, but she knew better. Mustn't split up the boys, she often groused, when the 4 of us met at a pub. The night before we flew to Islamabad, she complained that he had commitments everywhere, and to top it off, had just agreed to serve as a cameraman on an expedition immediately after Nanga Parbat, despite having no experience whatsoever with video cameras. You know what his motto is, she asked? No time, no time, no time. If you ask him if he wants some eggs, he'll answer, no time, no time, no time. She said he'd given so many interviews across the country for the last 2 weeks that after he'd finally gotten home and fallen into their bed, he told her that he needed to go on this next expedition as a rest. She'd thrown all of his clothes out into the street. It was raining too, Jacek added, holding the sleeve of his sweater up. This is still wet. Our daughter complains that they come back a wreck and we have to fit our lives to their schedules, Agnieszka said. She always says, why should we? He never fits his to ours. And first, they're unbelievably full of themselves. They did just conquer the world, and then they're depressed, Christina said. At parties, I'll hear the women with their big eyes asking how they do it. And I want to just grab their faces and say, the question is, how do I do it? Who wants another drink, Jacek asked. She went on to say that she'd begun to realize how many people this mountain had killed only by listening to our other friends talk about it. Then she'd broken down and done some internet research, after which she wished she hadn't. High altitudes aren't as dangerous as everyone makes them out to be, Jacek told her. You could just as easily get killed crossing the road. Yeah, Christina said, if you painted yourself black and crossed only on moonless nights. I like the old days when they were out of touch for weeks, Agnieszka said. At least then you could manage your anger and fear and go about your life. It's not like we don't take every precaution, Jacek told her. Well, there's a relief, she answered. That should prevent the avalanches and the blizzards and the oxygen starvation and the cold. Jacek reminded his wife that he'd shown her the entry he had made in his notebook the morning of his summit attempt on Annapurna. Quote, it's high time I stopped this kind of Russian roulette and started thinking of someone other than myself. Unquote. And then she pointed out that after he had finished that entry, he'd left for the summit.